With Sony's mobile future uncertain, 3 new Xperia Z5 phones were released this year. A compact version, which is more affordable, smaller, and made with more plastic pieces. A premium model, which is pretty pricey, a little more showy, and pushes the envelope a little. But right in the middle, we have the standard Sony Xperia Z5. Hello everybody, I'm Crystal, and Gary Sims did a great review on the Xperia Z5 Compact a couple weeks ago, so make sure you go check that out too to see the differences between these two devices. But for now, let's take a closer look at the Sony Xperia Z5. When it comes to design, Sony hasn't had any drastic changes in their Xperia lineup, ever. But that might not be too much of a bad thing for some people. The Z5 is very square like the other Xperia phones. The corners are ever so slightly rounded, but nowhere near as much as other phones. I always thought the LG G4 looked very rectangular, but it's nothing compared to the Z5's design. It's definitely not my favorite smartphone when it comes to design, but I do think it has a sense of luxury and elegantness to it, more so than other smartphones on the market right now. Around the Z5, we have a smooth metal frame with frosted glass on the back of the phone. It looks really beautiful and feels really good too, but the glass does make it a little slippery, especially since it's a frosted back, and that gives it more of a matte feel to it. It's not too thick, although thicker than the Z3 Plus at 7.3mm all around, and it's pretty light even though it may not look it at 154 grams. We have the Sony logo and the Xperia logo on the back, along with an NFC icon, which is a little weird. Although NFC is important, it's not like some huge standout feature or anything, but who cares, I guess. On the top left, we have our 23-megapixel camera with its LED flash underneath. The front of the phone sports a 5.2-inch HD screen with some decently sized bezels on the top and the bottom. And above it is a front-facing camera and a little notification light that by default is white, but you have the freedom to change. Now if you look a little more closely at the front of the Z5, you'll notice these front-facing stereo speakers on the top and bottom, almost hidden to keep the front of the phone looking very clean. They sound good too. They're not very loud, however, and they are definitely better speakers on phones, but the front-facing speakers found here on the Z5 are better than any speaker found on the bottom or back of any other phone. On the right side of the phone, we're greeted with a lot of buttons that Xperia users have been familiar with. The power button is on top and placed almost near the middle, and this year, Sony designed the power button to be flush with this border, so you have to kind of push it into the phone to activate it. It does have a nice squishy click to it, but it can be a little hard to initiate that click with it being so flush with the side. The power button does double this time though, as a fingerprint scanner. It's a pretty small area for a fingerprint scanner, but it does a pretty good job at reading your print. It's quite fast, not the fastest, but it gets the job done. And overall, the reliability is decent. It depends what finger you're using. You'll probably end up registering your left pointer finger or your right thumb. It may be a little awkward to use the scanner with your left pointer finger, so it may have some trouble scanning sometimes, but your right thumb should be very reliable. Below it is our more conventional volume buttons. They feel very responsive and stick out like we're used to with volume buttons on phones. The only thing that makes these buttons a little unconventional is the placement. They are so low. Whether you're using the phone in your right hand or left hand, it can be a little awkward to press them. And finally, on the bottom, we have a dedicated camera button which sticks out and has a lot of travel to it, and it feels quite nice. So when holding this button, the camera app will quickly launch, which is very convenient. And once in the app, by clicking the button, it will snap a picture. This button is really only practical when taking pictures in landscape, as it feels almost like you're snapping a picture with a DSLR or something. The bottom is home to our micro USB charging port and what looks like a keychain hook. The left side is where we can access our SIM card and yes, also our micro SD card. The problem is, it's really hard to access them. First, you have to use your nail to undo the flap, and then continue using your nail to pull out the thin plastic housing. If you're picking up this phone and are constantly exchanging SD cards, maybe make sure you skip a finger when nail filing. One reason these may be so hard to access is because they need to be kept well protected, as this phone is IP68 certified, dustproof, and water resistant. The Xperia Z5 is sporting a 5.2-inch IPS screen at a 1080 by 1920 resolution. It's a pretty nice screen too, and in terms of colors, it's fantastic. Colors are very vibrant and whites are very white, maybe leaning a little towards the warm side, but they still look very nice. If you want a more saturated image, you can easily do so within settings. The screen gets pretty bright too. You may have trouble seeing it in direct sunlight at times, but it can get brighter than a good amount of phones out right now. Apart from colors though, the HD screen is not quite as beautiful as a lot of other 1080 by 1920 phone displays. It almost appears to be a slight step back from the Z3 Plus. It seems like there's a very slight haze over everything in a way. Coming from the OnePlus 2, that has an even lower pixel density than the Z5 definitely is weaker in terms of screens. When triggering fast animations like the pull-down notification menu, text and icons seem to have a subtle ghost effect to them, more so than other HD phones. All that being said, the display is definitely not bad and outperforms a lot of displays when it comes to color representation, but in the other areas, it falls behind. Sony stuck with the Snapdragon 810 processor on the Xperia Z5, along with the 3 gigs of RAM. With this phone being 10 grams thicker than its predecessor, you would think Sony would be able to put a bigger battery in the Z5, but it's actually 30 mAh smaller than the Z3 Plus at 2,900 mAh. Really, 30 mAh isn't much of a difference, as we'll find out later. So does the A10 processor make the phone hot? Well, when I first got the phone and installed on my 40-something apps I use at once, yeah, it got hot. But from what I could tell, just as hot as it did on my LG G4, Note 5, and OnePlus 2 when doing the same thing. In normal use though, I never noticed the phone getting the slightest bit hot. But when doing more CPU intensive stuff like gaming, the Z5 did get noticeably hot. Once again, no more than any other phone I've used. Maybe technically it does overheat a bit more than other processors, but I wasn't able to notice it by just feeling. Gary Sims tested this more in depth in his Z5 compact review on this channel. And pretty much for an app to stop working due to overheating, you have to really be doing something crazy, like shooting 4K video for over 20 minutes. The great thing about Sony Xperia phones is their software. The Xperia Z5 is running Android Lollipop 5.1.1, and it actually looks close to stock Android. There are a lot of additions Sony added to their software, however, but not too much to make stock Android designs unrecognizable. For example, you can change the clock style on the lock screen to some different options, and you can rearrange the icons or even hide some in the notification pull-down. And the freedom to decide which icons are shown on the status bar is also present with the Z5 software. So you can hide the battery percentage or time, kind of like what you're capable of doing with Android Marshmallow. Themes are also available that include live wallpapers that move depending on where you touch. My favorite is the Xperia theme that will slowly change color depending on how often you use the phone. The important thing is, everything runs very smoothly. When you first turn on the phone after powering off, there will be a bit of a lag for a couple of minutes, but after that you shouldn't notice any stutters or crashes. By default, the app opening and closing animations are bumped up to make the overall experience feel very snappy. Sony gave their newest Xperia a bump-up camera sensor from 20.7 megapixels to 23 megapixels. Along with that, we have our autofocus, LED flash, and although there's no optical image stabilization, unfortunately, the software video stabilization does a pretty nice job, as you'll soon see. So I was pretty excited to test out this camera because some of the best smartphone camera sensors are supplied by Sony. And all over Sony's website, they boast about the picture quality this thing can take. They even flaunt the megapixel count on the back of the phone. Unfortunately, the camera is not as great as you would think, and on top of that, the whole megapixel count is very misleading. I'll have to address first that even though Sony is boasting that the Xperia Z5 is a 23 megapixel camera, really that should mean 8 megapixels. Sure, the Z5 is capable of shooting in 23 megapixels, but for whatever reason, the camera software is not optimized for it. So when comparing a 23 megapixel shot to an 8 megapixel shot, the 8 megapixel shot will oftentimes look undoubtedly better. Better colors, better dynamic range, and better looking textures. Sony seems to know this as well, as 8 megapixels is enabled by default. But there are times where 23 megapixels look better, so it just makes things a little confusing. If you don't want to have to mess around with these settings, just stick to 8. These next pictures were taken with 8 megapixels. So in normal lighting conditions, pictures are actually very nice. There's a lot of detail in these pictures and colors look very good. They have a nice saturated look to them. There's a little sharpening going on, but most of the time it leads to a better picture. Dynamic range looks very good. Sometimes it can overexpose a little, but nothing too unusual. Here's a situation where I think 23 megapixels actually makes a better looking picture. When you're standing really far away from a very complicated looking focus point, the 8 megapixel software enhancements seem to be a little too much over sharpening everything. So using the unoptimized 23 megapixels actually ends up looking better than the optimized 8. See what I mean? This just gets confusing. Anyway, medium light pictures is where the quality will begin to take a dip. They still look very nice, but you'll start to see some purple creeping into the darker areas of the photos. And then when you get into low light pictures, forget about it. The purple has attacked. Anything that is dark looking will have this purple hue to it. The same can be said for the front-facing 5.1 megapixel camera. In good light, pictures look very good. Nice details, and it exposes perfectly. In medium light, selfies are still great. Even in low light, selfies look pretty good. Details are lost and photos can be a bit grainy, but the colors are better than the rear facing in low light, it seems. To get that purple hue in selfies, you have to go to extreme low light. Video looks very good on the Z5. Everything seems exposed correctly, and even though there's no optical image stabilization, the software makes up for it and creates a pretty smooth image. I was pleasantly surprised. Like I said before, 4K is available too, although when shooting for long periods of time, the phone may overheat. There's also tons of camera features and effects like AR effects, multi-camera, face-in-picture, and more. Like I said, the battery is ever so slightly smaller at 2,900 mAh, but it doesn't seem to affect the battery life. The Z5 should last you an entire day, especially if you use the many battery saving modes that Sony packed into the software, like Stamina Mode and Ultra Stamina Mode. Without using any battery saving modes, I was able to get at least 4.5 to 5 hours of screen on time with the Xperia Z5, and that's with spending lots of time browsing the web, sending lots of texts, and taking some pictures throughout the day. It's a very reliable battery, and with Quick Charge 2.0, you can charge very fast. So is the Sony Xperia Z5 worth picking up over its predecessor, the Z3 Plus? Well, there's not really much new here. There's a fingerprint scanner that works very well. There's a new and bigger camera sensor, but it doesn't really make much of a difference. And the internals are pretty identical. I don't think it's worth upgrading if you already own the Z3 Plus. If having a fantastic camera isn't too much of a concern for you, and you're looking for a reliable, elegant looking phone with enhanced stock Android software, the Sony Xperia Z5 could be a good choice, if you don't mind its price tag, of course. Well, thanks for watching my review, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it, and comment below letting me know what you think of the Sony Xperia Z5. Also, make sure you check out these other cool videos on the side here, and if you want the Android Authority app, make sure you click up here on the Google Play Store link. And last but not least, head on over to AndroidAuthority.com for more full coverage, as we are your source for all things Android.